Come gather round people wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing.
Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses, a series on the history of the Christian faith. In this video, we're going to look at the missionary endeavours of two men, Frumentius, who went to the people of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, and Ulfilas, who went to the Gothic people of Western Europe. We'll then look at the life and the ministry of John Chrysostom, or John the Golden Mouth, who had a reputation, like Ambrose, of being a powerful and brave preacher. However, we're going to mainly focus on church practices from around the year 300 through to 600. And we'll look at church governance or polity, liturgy, Christian art, church music, as well as a number of other things. But we're going to begin by looking at the historical events of the late 4th and early 5th centuries. We're going to begin by looking at a few events that took place in the 4th century that concerned the Roman Church. On two occasions, there were two bishops of Rome at the one time, Liberius and Felix in 353, and then Damasus and Ursinus in the year 366. You'll notice there's an asterisk by two of these popes' names, and these are the ones that are not recognised by the Catholic Church today and are referred to as anti-popes. With regard to Damasus and Ursinus, they were elected simultaneously on the same day by different factions within the church and in different churches in Rome. The supporters of each later clashed violently, and the prefects had to be called in to preserve order, but further bloodshed and violence ensued. Finally, Ursinus was exiled, and once Damasus was securely consecrated as Bishop of Rome, his men then attacked Ursinus's remaining supporters, who were seeking refuge in one of the basilicas in Rome. And as a result, it's estimated that 137 supporters of Ursinus were massacred. Both these incidents affected and tarnished the Roman See. In the year 382, the New Testament canon of its 27 books was formally established at a local council at Rome. Although Athanasius had earlier accepted these 27 books, this was now an official recognition by the Western Church. In the year 395, the Christian emperor Theodosius died, and it was Theodosius, if you remember, who had formally established Christianity as the official Roman religion. After Theodosius's death, the empire again divided. Apart from a brief attempt by the later emperor Justinian, this time the division would be permanent. Honorius became the emperor of the West when he was just 9 years of age. Theodoret, who was the bishop of Cyrus in Syria, in writing his church history, he mentions the story of a Christian monk, Telemachus. Now, Telemachus was a monk living in Greece, and he lived alone most of his life, but at some point in the early 5th century, during the time and the rule of Honorius, he felt that God was telling him to go to Rome. Theodoret said, Honorius, who inherited the empire of Europe, put a stop to the gladiatorial combats which had long been held at Rome. The occasion of his doing so arose from the following circumstance. A certain man of the name of Telemachus had embraced the ascetic life. He had set out from the east, and for this reason he had repaired to Rome. And so around the year 404, Telemachus arrived in Rome. He then proceeded to the amphitheatre, which is thought to be the Colosseum. And the story continued. There, when the abominable spectacle was being exhibited, he went himself into the stadium and, stepping down into the arena, endeavoured to stop the men who were wielding their weapons against one another. The spectators of the slaughter were indignant, and inspired by the triad fury of the demon who delights in those bloody deeds, stoned the peacemaker to death. With this tragic death of Telemachus, Honorius subsequently outlawed gladiatorial combats. And the story continues. When the admirable emperor was informed of this, he numbered Telemachus in the array of victorious martyrs and put an end to that impious spectacle. How historical is this event? Unfortunately, we only have Theodoret's record. We do know that Honorius outlawed these combats in the year 404, but he was already not happy with them because he had previously outlawed them 5 years earlier, in the year 399. The end of the Roman or the Western Empire took place gradually, and it occurred through a number or a succession of invading barbarian armies. In the year 410, the Visigoths captured Rome and held it for 3 days. Then, just over 40 years later, Attila the Hun stood poised to do the same. However, it was through the intervention of Leo, the Bishop of Rome, also known as Pope Leo I, this threat was averted. According to the tradition is that Leo went out and spoke to Attila directly and persuaded him not to attack the city. In the year 455, the Vandals then attacked Rome. They sacked the city, although, again through Leo's influence, the church suffered little damage and few people were killed, although the city treasures were pillaged. Finally, in the year 476, the reign of the last emperor ended. And so, officially, this was the end of the Western Roman Empire. And it was into this power vacuum that the church, and in particular the church in Rome under the papacy, emerged triumphant. With the successive invasions that we've talked about, this is how Europe looked by the year 500. You have the Ostrogoths in modern-day Italy, and the Visigoths in southern France, Spain and Portugal, the Vandals in northern Africa, and then in central and northern France you have the Burgundians, and then the Franks. And of course in the east, however, the Roman Empire continued, but it was based in the city of Constantinople and would be called the Byzantine Empire. It is Frumentius who is credited with bringing Christianity to the kingdom of Aksum, which is in the area of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. Frumentius was born in Tyre, which is located in modern-day Lebanon, somewhere in the early 4th century, and was raised as a Christian. As a young boy, he and his brother, while on a voyage with their uncle to Ethiopia, were captured by some Aksumites, approximately around 316. This took place near the shores of the Red Sea. The people on board were killed, but the 2 boys were spared and were later taken to the kingdom of Aksum. They were brought before the king, and there they worked as slaves in his court for many years. Over those years, their abilities were noted and so were raised to positions of trust. Then shortly before his death, the king of Aksum released the boys, and they prepared to go home. However, the Queen prevailed on them to stay in the kingdom to educate their young son and the heir to the throne, Ezana. So it was around this time that they began to teach the Christian faith to the people of Aksum, and many were converted, including the king, Ezana. As a result of this, the Aksumites formally accepted Christianity as a state religion around the year 325 or 328, about the time of the Nicene Council. Frumentius then went to the city of Alexandria, where he visited Athanasius, and he requested priests and others to help the new church in Aksum. However, Athanasius saw that Frumentius was in himself well equipped for the task, and so he appointed him as the first bishop of Aksum. King Ezana built many churches throughout the kingdom of Aksum. And interestingly, Aksum was the first state ever to use the image of the cross on its coins. Ethiopian tradition credits Frumentius with the development of what's called the Ge'ez script and of producing the first Ge'ez translation of the New Testament. Frumentius died around the year 383. Subsequent to Frumentius, there's been a long tradition of a Christian presence in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and they became, as we've already heard, Monophysite, or more accurately, Miaphysite. In the heart of Ethiopia, about 650 kilometres north of Addis Ababa, there are 11 churches which were carved out of solid rock. These have been dated to the late 12th century, probably built by a king who ruled after the decline of the Aksum Empire. And this particular king set out to build a new Jerusalem after the Muslim conquests had halted Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Today, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has a membership of somewhere around 45 to 50 million people, the majority who live in Ethiopia. It's also a founding member of the World Council of Churches. The word Tewahedo is a Ge'ez word meaning being made one, which links with them being Miaphysites. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is also in communion with the Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which has about 3 million members. Ulfilas, or his Gothic name Wulfila, meaning little wolf, originally came from Cappadocia in modern-day Turkey. This was about 20 years before the Cappadocian Fathers. When the young Ulfilas and his parents were captured by the Goths, he was taken into captivity into the area of modern Hungary, and it was there he grew up, and there he learned Greek and Latin. When he was an adult, he returned to his homeland and was ordained a bishop. He was, though, unfortunately, Arian in his theology, although some ancient writers said that he became Arian as a result of political pressure from the Arian Byzantine emperor. Subsequently, he returned to the Goths as a missionary and lived in modern-day Bulgaria. And while he was there, he devised the Gothic script, and he presided over the translation of the Bible from Greek into Gothic. This particular example is called the Silver Bible, and it may have actually been written for the Ostrogothic king Theodoric in the 6th century. Just a little more on the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. After the time of Ulfilas, the Goths moved westward, and King Theodoric eventually established his capital at Ravenna, which today is part of northern Italy. In the year 511, the Visigoths were brought under Theodoric's direct control, and he also had influence over the areas of Burgundy in southern France and the Vandal area of northern Africa. And this formed a Gothic superstate which extended from the Atlantic right through to the Danube. Now, even though Theodoric was Arian, he was generally religiously tolerant and so respected the Western or the Catholic Church. And so it was able to survive and prosper during this period. Although perhaps towards the end of his rule, he was not quite as tolerant as he had been earlier. John Chrysostom, a leader who was willing to stand up against error in all its forms. He was noted as a gifted preacher, as his epitaph, Chrysostom, reveals. It's derived from two Greek words, chrysos and stoma, meaning gold and mouth, essentially translated as golden mouth, which was a reference to his preaching ability. This epitaph first appeared towards the end of the 5th century, so within 100 years of his death. But during his lifetime, he was simply known as John. John was born in Antioch in 347. He was a contemporary of Ambrose, who was a little older, Jerome, who was about his age, and Augustine, who was a little younger. Antioch is today the city of Antakya on the Orontes River, and it's located in modern-day southern Turkey. John's father was Secundus and his mother Anthusa. His father was a general in the Eastern Roman army, but he died when John was very young. He and a sister were reared by his mother Anthusa, who may have been only around 20 years of age at the time. Anthusa was a Christian, and she purposely did not remarry, but resolved to devote her life to her 2 children. Antioch was, around this time, the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire, after Rome and Alexandria. It was a city of about 200,000, with, it is thought, half of its population being Christian. Antioch was a very important city in Christian tradition. It was the residence of Paul for a time, and Antioch served as a base for the missions of Paul and Barnabas, and then later Paul and Silas. According to the book of Acts, this was the place where believers were first called Christians. One of its earliest Christian leaders was Ignatius, who in the early part of the 2nd century was taken as a prisoner to Rome and later executed there. And we have a number of his letters to different churches which give us some very helpful insights into the church of that time. One of the oldest churches that we know of is the cave church of St. Peter, pictured here. While the facade is probably from the 11th century, its interior has elements which date back to the time of John Chrysostom in the 4th century. So because of this rich Christian heritage, and that it was a significant city in its own right, it became part of the Pentarchy, meaning it was one of the 5 major churches in the Roman Empire. There was Rome, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Constantinople. As such, the Bishop of Antioch had a special place of honour. From about the 4th century on, the bishops of each of these cities were given the special title of Patriarch. John began his education with the aim of becoming a lawyer. He studied under Libanius, who was a famous teacher of literature and oratory in the East. Libanius was a strong pagan and saw potential in the young John, so much so that he wanted him to be his replacement when he died. Libanius became devastated when John became a Christian, saying, "The Christians have stolen him from us." It was during this time as a student that the Emperor Julian attempted to restore paganism as the official religion of the empire in 361. However, this attempt was short-lived when he died in battle in 363. When he was about 18, John came to an understanding of the vanity of his secular career and gave up his aspirations to become a lawyer. He wanted to be baptised, and so he put his name down on the list of those preparing for baptism. This group were called the catechumens. The general expectation of this time was that there was a 3-year period of learning or being catechised into the Christian faith prior to baptism. He began attending a monastic school in Antioch, where he studied scripture and its interpretation and general theology. Then, around 368, or possibly as late as 373, he was baptised. He was only a young man in his 20s. After his baptism, he said to his mother that he wanted to become an ascetic, an anchorite living in isolation. But Anthusa persuaded him not to do so until after her death, and out of respect, he followed her wishes. There was some compromise, though. He began to live like a monk, at home. He would sleep on the floor, eat only enough to be healthy, and spend a lot of time in meditation and prayer. And he did this for about 6 years until his mother died around the year 374. Sometime after his mother's death, he moved to the mountains to the south of Antioch, possibly the Nur Mountains, where he began living as a solitary monk or an anchorite, and he lived there for about 6 years. He survived on little food, denied himself sleep, and stood for most of the day and some of the night. But more positively, also read and attempted to memorise all of the scriptures. His strict lifestyle eventually impacted his health, and due to this he returned back to Antioch. It's thought that he caused long-term physical damage through his harsh monastic regime. Now back in Antioch, in 381 he was ordained a deacon. A deacon mainly had a role of assisting the priest in conducting the service, and this included leading prayers, reading the scriptures, and assisting with communion. But they were also required to call people to attention at the appropriate times. And in some places, such as Antioch, services were held every day. He also would have visited the sick and those needing spiritual encouragement and counsel as a deacon. And in some cases, he was permitted to give them communion. And it's possibly through acting as a deacon that he became to know and understand the needs of the poor. He was no longer living an isolated life away from everyday struggles of the ordinary people. Now he was involved in community, in serving the church, and the reality of the struggles of the poor may have influenced his later strong statements on the dangers of wealth. One of the most popular of his works, called On the Priesthood, was probably written sometime after he was ordained as a deacon. It arose after he had tricked his friend Basil into becoming a bishop, and it was almost an apology for why he rejected his appointment but tricked Basil. He gives the classic argument that the ends justify the means. But he also gives some other important advice. For example, to those seeking leadership positions in the church, they should check their motives. For there are many other qualities beside those already mentioned which the priest ought to have, but which I do not possess, and above all this one. His soul ought to be thoroughly purged from any lust after the office. For if he happens to have a natural inclination for this dignity, as soon as he attains it, a stronger flame is kindled, and the man being taken completely captive will endure innumerable evils in order to keep a secure hold upon it, even to the extent of using flattery or submitting to something base and ignoble. John was ordained a priest or in the Greek, a presbyter, under the direction of Bishop Flavian in the year 386. And for the next 11 years, he developed his rhetorical skills as a preacher. His sermons, also called homilies, reveal a wide range of topics covered. Around 640 of his homilies are still extant. Most of his sermons come from his time as a priest at Antioch, and we have them because they were transcribed by private stenographers. So they actually state what he said, not what he may have written down. Most of them are expositions on Paul's letters, such as Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians. There are also about 90 homilies on Matthew, 88 on the Gospel of John, 55 homilies on the book of Acts. While he didn't know Hebrew, there are a number of homilies on Genesis and the book of Psalms. As well as his homilies, there are other writings we have of John Chrysostom, including a public speech on Philogonius. His main preaching place was the Domus Aurea, which is depicted here on the right next to the palace in the middle. He preached exegetically. In other words, he focused on a particular book and then worked through it systematically, i.e. chapter by chapter and verse by verse. But of course, at this time, there were no chapters or verses, so it was just working through the book systematically. Exegetical preaching was not really taken up until the time of the Reformers in the 1500s. Context was also very important, and he focused on a literal, not allegorical meaning of the text. So in other words, he kept the context in mind when preaching and sought to discover the literal meaning of the text. And this was in contrast to the Alexandrian tendency towards allegorical interpretation. Because of these factors, his talks were practical and relevant, and he sought a practical application to the people of his day. And such straightforward preaching helped John to gain the interest of the people of Antioch. His sermons were impactful. It's claimed that his preaching was so powerful that the congregation was sometimes moved to tears, and then on other occasions to applaud and even stomp their feet. And he was particularly concerned about this more unruly behaviour, so he devoted a sermon to the topic of proper worship conduct. Yet he was aware of the fickleness of such adulation. My sermons are applauded merely from custom. Then everyone runs off to chariot racing. Again, it gives much more applause to the jockeys, showing indeed unrestrained passion for them. There they put their heads together with great attention and say with mutual rivalry, "This horse did not run well, this one stumbled, and one holds to this jockey and another to that. No one thinks any more of my sermons, nor of the holy and awesome mysteries that are accomplished here." He also spoke on a wide range of relevant topics and issues. For example, on theology, he obviously spoke about that. We have 10 extant sermons that relate to the issue of homoousios, in other words, the relationship with Jesus, the Son, and the Father. And he attacked those who argued against homoousios. And this, of course, was all related to the Arian controversy, which questioned the full divinity of Jesus, and this was still an ongoing issue in the empire. Regarding Christian living, other topics ranged from condemning abortion and prostitution and homosexuality, but also condemning the theatre. Then he also spoke about the dangers of wealth and materialism, and on the marriage relationship too. In this example, we can see his comments regarding Ephesians 5:22 to 24, which says, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church." And John said, You've seen the measure of obedience, here also the measure of love. Would you have your wife obedient unto you, as the church is to Christ? Take then yourself the same provident care for her, as Christ takes for the church. Yea, even if it should be needful for you to give your life for her, yea, and to be cut into pieces 10,000 times, yea, and to endure and undergo any suffering whatever, refuse it not. However, John also had his flaws. He has been accused of being anti-Semitic and of using spiteful notions about women. His harshest attacks against the Jews came in the year 386 in a number of sermons that he spoke in Antioch. The context was that Christians were freely participating in Jewish holidays and rituals, which John regarded as Judaizing. He preached 8 sermons, timed to correspond with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. He railed against the synagogue and he said it was no better than a theatre or a brothel. And worse, he said, the Jews have degenerated to the level of dogs. They are drunkards and gluttons. They beat their servants. They are ignorant of God. Their festivals are worthless. They are the Christ killers. This issue of Judaizing is interesting because in Acts 15 verses 1 and 2, it mentions that there were such concerns in Antioch over 300 years earlier. It says, "Then some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." And after engaging these men in sharp debate, Paul and Barnabas were appointed along with some other believers to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. This issue did not seem to easily disappear for Paul because he mentions it again in his letter to the church at Galatia in chapter 2. He says that there was a circumcision group in Antioch, and he was especially concerned about Peter's deference to this group. Paul said he had to rebuke him. So whether there's a connection between these two events or these two incidents is not clear because 300 years had passed, but it's something worth looking at. Yet while John could speak very strongly and perhaps harshly, he could also inspire and encourage his listeners. Here he talks about the Lord's Prayer. He said, "Consider how Jesus Christ teaches us to be humble by making us see that our virtue does not depend on our work alone, but on grace from on high." He commands each of the faithful who prays to do so universally for the whole world. For he did not say, "Thy will be done in me or in us," but on earth, the whole earth, so that error may be banished from it, truth take root in it, all vice be destroyed on it, virtue flourish on it, and earth no longer differ from heaven. One of the recurring themes of John Chrysostom's homilies is his emphasis on caring for the poor and needy. Echoing themes found in the Gospel of Matthew, he calls upon the rich to lay aside their materialism in favour of helping the poor. Do you wish to honour the body of Christ? Do not ignore him when he is naked. Do not pay him homage in the temple clad in silk, only then to neglect him outside, where he is cold and ill-clad. He who said, "This is my body," is the same who said, "You saw me hungry, and you gave me no food," and "Whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you did also to me." What good is it if the Eucharistic table is overloaded with golden chalices when your brother is dying of hunger? Start by satisfying his hunger, and then with what is left, you may adorn the altar as well. Regarding our motives, Motivation for John was crucial in carrying out our so-called good deeds. What's important, he argues, is the intentions of our heart. He said, helping a person in need is good in itself, but the degree of goodness is hugely affected by the attitude with which it is done. If you show resentment because you are helping the person out of a reluctant sense of duty, then the person may receive your help, but may feel awkward and embarrassed. This is because he will feel beholden to you. If, on the other hand, you help the person in a spirit of joy, then the help will be received joyfully. The person will feel neither demeaned or humiliated by your help, but rather will feel glad to have caused you pleasure by receiving your help. And joy is the appropriate attitude with which to help others, because acts of generosity are a source of blessing to the giver as well as the receiver. His words of encouragement also provide us with an example of his pastoral heart. He said, do not lose heart if you fail twice or thrice or even as much as 20 times. Take courage in both hands anew and begin again unwearied. Here are some brief points regarding the theology of John Chrysostom. Primarily, he was a practical preacher rather than a theologian, but that doesn't mean to say theology wasn't important to him. As we've mentioned, he preached against the opponents of homoousios, which revealed that he was very much against the Arians. With regard to salvation and free will, like other Greeks, he held a midway point between the semi-Pelagians and the Augustinians, although these terms were still being developed around this time. In other words, John believed that there was an element of free will in our salvation, although there are a number of places where he emphasises our inability to earn it. In a homily on Ephesians, he said, individual righteousness is not enough for salvation. Yet in other places he's more ambiguous. In his work on the priesthood, while he points out that salvation is a gift and that our good works are in response to God's grace, yet it seems that our hope of salvation still depends in some way on our actions. There is safety for you too who are strong, and this consists in making your hopes of salvation depend, next to the grace of God, on avoiding every act unworthy of this gift and of God who gave it. Like some others in Antioch in his day, he questioned the canonicity of the Apocalypse or the Book of Revelation, and they did so chiefly because of the difficulties of interpreting it and the dangers that would be forthcoming from that difficulty. He also spoke glowingly of the impact of the graves of the martyrs which people would visit. And he said, face to face with his, in other words, the martyr's grandeur, you realise how great is the gulf between your own self and his. The martyrs are in a position to speak freely in God's presence and to rejoice in his honour and glory. Yet note here there's no mention of petitions or prayers being made to these martyrs, as was the case later. In Chrysostom's mind, the martyrs were rather examples to be inspired by. In the year 387, an important incident called the Riot of the Statues took place in Antioch. The Emperor Theodosius had instituted more taxes on the people, and in response in Antioch there was a popular revolt. Bronze statues of the imperial family were toppled over and dragged through the streets. Some public buildings were burnt, and the governor was threatened with death. Effectively, these were acts of treason. As an immediate response, some city leaders were killed by the imperial officials. Emperor Theodosius then had all public buildings like theatres, baths, and the hippodrome closed, and judges were sent from Constantinople to investigate what had taken place. The residents feared an order of retribution was going to be enacted on the city and were overcome by dread, fearing what might take place. Some left the city and others stayed at home, leaving the streets generally deserted. And this fear was quite real because 3 years later in the city of Thessalonica, Theodosius enacted retribution on that city when a Roman official had been killed by a mob. And soldiers end up killing a few thousand people in response to this event. Meanwhile, back in Antioch, Bishop Valerian immediately left for Constantinople to placate the emperor, pleading for mercy on the population. John then preached a series of significant sermons, and he urged a change of heart. He said, "Improve yourselves now truly, not as when during one of the numerous earthquakes or in famine or drought or in similar visitations you leave off your sinning for 3 or 4 days and then begin the old life again." And the people responded. Then Bishop Valerian returned with the news that his appeals for clemency on the city had been heard by the emperor. And the status of the church and the reputation of John grew even more. John Chrysostom had also developed a liturgy to be used in churches. He'd begun to use it while he was the priest in Antioch, and it was refined while he was the patriarch in Constantinople later. Its use became widespread in Orthodox churches in the Byzantine Empire, and apart from some modifications, it's still in use in Orthodox churches today. This prayer from his liturgy can today be found in the Anglican prayer book, and as well it's used as a communal prayer in other denominations as well. Almighty God, you have given us grace at this time, with one accord to make our common supplications to you, and you have promised through your well-beloved Son that when 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name, you will grant their requests. Fulfill now, O Lord, our desires and petitions as may be best for us, granting us in this world knowledge of your truth, and in the age to come, life everlasting. In 397, Nectarius, the Bishop of Constantinople, died. The imperial court was at this time dominated by the eunuch Eutropius, and he wished to have John appointed to the position, as he was concerned about the growing influence of Theophilus, the patriarchal bishop of Alexandria. Theophilus had wanted his own man to be the Bishop of Constantinople, and not a rival from Antioch such as John. There was some awareness that John would be reluctant to accept the position, and because of his popularity, it was feared that the people of Antioch might riot when they heard that John was being asked. So, to avoid all this, and in order to get John to Constantinople, Eutropius effectively ordered his kidnapping. So John arrived in Constantinople and very reluctantly was consecrated bishop in 398. He was, at this time, about 50 years of age. Constantinople had become the capital of the empire in 324 when Constantine had moved it from Rome. According to John Chrysostom, the city had at this time about 100,000 inhabitants. Arguably, the Bishop of Constantinople, or the Patriarch, was the most powerful and influential church position in the empire at that time. The main church of his charge was the Great Church, or the Magna Ecclesia, and another significant church was the nearby Hagia Irene, or Holy Peace. We're not sure how many churches there were at this time, but 100 years later there were 14 in Constantinople. As the new bishop, he tried to raise the moral climate of the church and of Constantinople itself. Constantinople was not just the capital of the empire, it was a very wealthy city. And the church, by this stage, held an important position of prestige within the capital. Politically, the empire was ruled by the two sons of Theodosius, who had died in 395. Honorius, based in Rome, ruled the Western Empire, and Arcadius, based in Constantinople, over the East. Arcadius was only 17 when his father died, and he had just married his influential wife, Eudoxia, later that year. As an illustration of Eudoxia's later influence was that in the year 400, she was given the title Augusta, which was the female equivalent of Augustus. Church historian Justo Gonzalez said that Arcadius and his brother Honorius were indolent and inept, and it was into this situation that John had arrived. He found there were many problems within the church. His predecessor, Nectarius, had let the church slip into laxness. Nectarius would generously entertain people with sumptuous meals, and the finances of the church were in a shambles. There was the problem of simony, the buying of lucrative church positions in the east in places like Ephesus. And he had all offending bishops removed from their offices. He found that some of those appointed as priests were very unsuitable for the position. Others were indulgent and not really concerned with the cares and the concerns of the people. Many of the unmarried priests had what were called spiritual sisters. These were often nuns who lived with these priests performing housekeeping duties. John pointed out candidly that many of these so-called spiritual sisters became spiritual mothers. Some clergy were dismissed, and in other cases he actively opposed and condemned those clergy who had these spiritual sisters or who lived in luxury. He set an example. In contrast to others, he continued to live a simple life as a bishop. Much of the wealth that had adorned his bishop's palace was sold in order to feed the hungry, and his entertainings were very modest compared to his predecessor. And complaints in the form of praise of his predecessor began to be heard. His example of his lifestyle became a rebuke to the wealthy parishioners in the capital. He was not afraid to be critical of the clergy, for in his third homily on Acts he said, "I know not if there be many in the priesthood who are saved, but I know that many more perish." As was the case in Antioch, John was not afraid to speak out against those in positions of power and wealth, in particular against the materialism and lack of concern for the poor that they had. Early on, he denounced the extravagant dress of the wealthy women of Constantinople. However, Empress Eudoxia took this as a personal denunciation, and her hostility to John began. And this particular picture paints the wrong impression because John didn't directly condemn the behaviour and attitude of Eudoxia. Rather, he was more subtle, and she took it more personally. He challenged the men by proclaiming that a woman had as much right to expect fidelity from her husband as he did of her. And of course, this alienated many men who had mistresses, etc. And so resentment against John's direct preaching had begun. He continued to preach boldly against self-centered materialism of the wealthy, just as he had back in Antioch. And these excerpts from the sermons at Antioch illustrate his feelings on this topic. He said, "How think you that you can obey Christ's commandments when you spend your time collecting interest, piling up loans, buying slaves like livestock, and merging business with business? And that is not all. Upon this you heap injustice, taking possession of lands and houses, and multiplying poverty and hunger." And in another homily he said, "It is not possible for one to be wealthy and just at the same time." His preaching was reminiscent of the prophet Amos. He said, "The gold bit on your horse, the gold circlet on the wrist of your slave, the gilding on your shoes means that you are robbing the orphan and starving the widow." One of his regular topics was the paganism that was influencing the church at Constantinople. He spoke against pagan amusements such as the theatre and the horse races at the hippodrome, and he was particularly critical of Christians regarding their priorities, and in particular was worried about their laxness. He said, "If you ask Christians who is Amos or Obadiah, how many apostles there were or prophets, they stand mute. But if you ask them about the horses or drivers, they answer with more solemnity than sophists or rhetors." But in addition to his strongly worded preaching, he also supported mission work. For example, there was a Goths church in Constantinople, and John preached there. And he also sent missionaries to Goth areas in the Crimea and the north of the Black Sea. He also had an influence on John Cassian, who lived in Constantinople at this time. And John Cassian would go to the west and have a lasting impact on Western monasticism. The slave and eunuch Eutropius had been a close advisor to the emperor and helped to arrange Eudoxia's marriage to him. He was even given the title consul, and it's thought that he had a great sway over Arcadius. He'd been instrumental in getting John to be the Bishop of Constantinople, as we've noted already. And as mentioned, this was much to the chagrin of Theophilus, the Bishop of Alexandria. It's thought that Eutropius expected favours from John after having given him his appointment, and of course, this wasn't forthcoming, and Eutropius began to resent John's appointment. There was an incident when a number of people were concerned with what they saw as the tyranny of Eutropius. Eutropius decided to act against them, and they fled to the church to seek sanctuary. Eutropius arrived with soldiers, but John did not allow them entry. Eutropius then went to the emperor, Arcadius, but the emperor supported John. It was the beginning of the end for Eutropius. Eutropius's fall from favour came particularly from Eudoxia, who was jealous of his influence, and eventually he was deposed from his position. The mob now called for retribution, and soldiers were sent for his arrest. Eutropius fled to the church, where he now sought sanctuary. He was found clinging to one of the legs of the communion table there by John. He then concealed him and confronted the soldiers who had entered the church in order to arrest Eutropius. However, John bravely refused to surrender him, saying, "None shall violate the sanctuary save over my body. The church is the bride of Christ, who has entrusted her honour to me, and I will never betray it." John was led before the emperor with 2 lots of spearmen on either side. He spoke to Arcadius, arguing for the church's right to protect those seeking asylum, and the emperor agreed, no doubt with some displeasure. Empress Eudoxia wanted to remove John from his position of influence, and she had a willing ally in the form of Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria. Now, John had to visit Ephesus to deal with some church matters there. So Eudoxia, Theophilus, and other of his enemies planned a plot against him. When he returned, they called the Synod of the Oak and put his theology on trial. There were 29 so-called ridiculous charges, according to Justo Gonzales, and John himself refused to attend. The charges included his views on the Trinity, for being a follower of Origen, and using excessive allegory, as well as other issues. He was also accused of improper remarks against the empress. In response to these charges, he preached a sermon, some might say imprudently, about Elijah's rebuke of Jezebel, implying that Eudoxia was Jezebel and he Elijah. John was condemned by Theophilus and his partisan synod, and Arcadius, prodded by Eudoxia, ordered John into exile. His supporters rallied behind him, and many of the clergy from outside the city gathered at the capital, saying that at John's request they would form a synod and condemn Theophilus. There was also concern over a popular uprising in support of John. So in order to avoid bloodshed, John decided to leave peacefully, and 3 days after the order was given, he surrendered to the authorities. Then that night, before he'd left, there was an earthquake. Taking this as a sign of divine displeasure, Eudoxia persuaded her husband to have the order reversed. The order was almost immediately, and he was reinstated to his former position. Obviously, this wasn't an easy time for John, and his earlier words regarding being a pastor were now personally relevant. He had written, "I know my own soul, how feeble and puny it is. I know the magnitude of this ministry and the great difficulty of the work. For more stormy billows vex the soul of the priest than the gales which disturb the sea." However, the conflict only had a brief lull for a few months. It resumed again when Eudoxia placed a silver statue of herself near the main churches of Constantinople. According to the historical account, the Chronicle of Theophanes, the Confessor, written between 810 and 815, this is what took place. In this year, the Empress Eudoxia had a silver statue made of herself and set it up in a place called Ptarcheia, near St. Irene. The city prefect, being a Manichaean and a supporter of paganism, organised noisy choirs and dancing in front of the statue and raised a commotion, which distressed John, since it did not allow him to celebrate the Holy Liturgy in peace, for it frequently interrupted the psalm singing. The Holy John inveighed verbally against the prefect, who roused Eudoxia against John, saying that the latter was annoyed by the honour given to her statue. So this built up more resentment of Eudoxia against John. And the story is then taken up by one who was actually in Constantinople at the time. The church historian Socrates of Constantinople, who died in 429, tells us that the empress once more applied his expressions to herself, as indicating marked contempt toward her own person. She therefore endeavoured to procure the summoning of another council of bishops against him. When John became aware of this, he delivered in the church that celebrated oration commencing with these words: "Again Herodias raves, again she is troubled. She dances again and again, desires to receive John's head in a charger." This, of course, exasperated the empress still more. Arcadius finally had had enough and had John exiled permanently. He once again agreed to depart peaceably. However, in response, the people were in uproar and the so-called Great Church was burnt down, and there were even threats to burn down the imperial palace. Some of John's supporters were arrested and tortured, and others were banished from the city. John was exiled to Caucasus, which is modern-day Goxan, in the area of Cappadocia, and he spent a couple of years there. However, he was still able to receive some financial assistance from his wealthy supporters, and he continued to write letters to Constantinople. And meanwhile, others had come to his defence, such as Innocent, the Bishop of Rome. The widespread criticism of the emperor meant that he needed to be silenced even more, and so John was exiled even further away. So in order to remove him away as much as possible, he was sent to Pityus on the Black Sea, which was just on the border of the empire. He was forced to walk in bad weather, and as a result, on the 14th of September 1407, on the way at Comana in the area of Pontus, he died. He was aged 58. Knowing that his end was coming, he asked to be taken into a church that was beside the road. He took communion and then spoke briefly his last words, which were said to have been, "Glory be to God for all things." His body was then carried on to Pityus and he was buried there. Later, his remains were brought back to Constantinople, where he'd been bishop for only 4 years. To conclude with, here are the beautiful words of the prayer of John Chrysostom. O Lord, do not deprive your heavenly blessings. O Lord, deliver me from eternal torment. O Lord, if I've sinned in my mind or thought, in word or deed, forgive me. O Lord, deliver me from every ignorance and heedlessness, from pettiness of the soul and stony hardness of heart. O Lord, deliver me from every temptation. O Lord, enlighten my heart darkened by evil desires. O Lord, I, being a human being, have sinned. Do you, being God, forgive me in your loving kindness, for you know the weakness of my soul. O Lord, send down your grace to help me, that I may glorify your holy name. O Lord Jesus Christ, inscribe me, your servant, in the book of life, and grant me a blessed end. O Lord my God, even if I have done nothing good in your sight, yet grant me according to your grace that I may make a start in doing good. O Lord, sprinkle on my heart the dew of your grace. O Lord of heaven and earth, remember me, your sinful servant, cold of heart and impure, in your kingdom.